Welcome to training course, Digital Presentation, and Preservation of Europe Ritual Cuisine. Module 2. Basic Theory and Practice, Theoretical Basics of Photography. The photographic genres. Street photography. Portraits. Landscape photography. This lesson aims to provide students with the basic notions and concepts regarding focus and the depth of field. At the end of the lesson, students will know the main techniques for the realization of photographs concerning the photographic genres of street photography, portrait and landscape photography. Photography, just like any other form of artistic expression, can be declined in multiple genres. A sculpture, for example, can be made of bronze or wood or marble. A painting can be in oil or a fresco or a watercolor. The tools do not change, but the techniques with which works of art are created do. Thus in photography, multiple subjects can be photographed, and for each subject the tools remain more or less the same, but the techniques with which they are shot change. In photography, the two elements we use are always the same, namely the camera and the light. But in the photographic genre that we decide to approach, we can have different variables to control and different tools that will help us to obtain a correct image. The first genre we will see is street photography. What is street photography? Which photographs can be defined as such? Street photography is a photographic genre, more precisely, a genre of reportage, which is basically realized with spontaneous and unprepared photographs. Like every story, it has its own fil rouge that refers to a well-defined design intent. The first genre we will see is street photography. What is street photography? Which photographs can be defined as such? Street photography is a photographic genre, more precisely, a genre of reportage, which is basically realized with spontaneous and unprepared photographs. Like every story, it has its own fil rouge that refers to a well-defined design intent. The street photographer does not walk and randomly photographs what happens to him in front of the lens. He has a project in mind and moves, following a logic and a well-defined narrative line. When the work is finished, he creates a reportage, which becomes a portrait of civil society. Being a street photographer means representing our way of life, the places where we meet, the spaces we share and where we live, in short, trying to give voice and represent our society. In street photography, the most important thing is the spontaneity of the shot. These are not stolen photos but snapshots of reality that document society in all its forms and all its nuances, which does not mean that everything is left completely to chance. The element of spontaneity must in fact be supported by the fundamental elements of photography, that is the composition, correct exposure and the effects that we want to appear in our photography. The street photographer carefully chooses the position from which to take the photographs, studying the light and the shots, choosing the most suitable lens, all waiting for the moment to be immortalized. It is important that the photographer is invisible, or at least that his presence must not in any way modify or alter the state of things. Another important skill that a street photographer must have is knowing how to read the situation and know how to adapt to it, reacting accordingly, in order to take home the desired shot. A good street photographer must therefore be able to read light and choose the correct location to photograph, understand people's movements, pay attention to everything that happens in the place he has chosen to shoot, know how to harmonize all the elements that are in the chosen place. To take pictures. As for the equipment, the street photographer must walk and move with agility, therefore the equipment must be minimal and light. Usually, lenses with a reduced focal length are used, therefore wide angle not too pushed, between 50 mm and 35 mm. Perfect, and widely used, is also the 28 mm. One of the best ways to learn how to do street photography is to observe the shots of the great masters. Not only to take interesting ideas but to understand the fundamentals of photographic composition and how these great artists of photography were able to use light. Surely one of the cornerstones of this photographic genre is the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, who is also considered the most influential photographer of the 20th century. His black and white photographs, his decisive moment aesthetic, have been the dominant model of the entire last century, and probably of this one as well. Cartier-Bresson has always considered photography as a form of art, an extension of painting. Vivian Maier is an American photographer born in New York in 1926. Lived between New York and Chicago, she works as a nanny and in her spare time she devotes herself to documentary photography. Unknown photographer to all, in 2007 the director John Maloof bought his shots and negatives in an auction house, discovering a great photographer. Vivian Maier reproduces the emotional chronicle of everyday reality, expressing in her works the sensitivity of her European origins combined with the typically American feeling of freedom and emancipation. The subjects of his photographs are people whom the artist met in the slums of cities, fragments of a chaotic reality that teems with life, instants captured in their simple spontaneity. Helen Levitt is a photographer known for her spontaneous images of New York's popular neighborhoods. A pioneer of street photography, Helen Levitt has played a crucial role in the history of photography. Helen Levitt was one of the leading exponents of American street photography. His images spontaneously and candidly recounted life in New York from the 1930s to the 1980s. Levitt's photography rejects the idea that a single photograph can capture the whole truth. The genre of portrait photography was probably the first genre that developed. Photography made it possible to portray people and families in a faster and cheaper way than painting and was therefore accessible to everyone, while painted portraits were reserved only for wealthy people and families. The purpose of portrait photography is to visualize the face, expression, mood and personality of individuals or groups. The face and eyes are therefore the target to be photographed, while the background and the body of the subject become secondary. When a portrait of a person is made, inevitably choices have to be made about what to shoot. If we photograph the whole figure, from head to toe, the face and eyes will be small. Therefore we are forced to cut off the rest of the body from the frame to allow the face to take on greater proportions and be better visible. The cut for the portrait shots is not done randomly but following certain rules. The cuts in portrait photography are very close-up, medium close-up and the American cut. The very close-up is obtained when the face occupies the entire frame and there are no other elements of the body that become part of the image. The close-up is obtained by choosing a shot similar to the previous one but widens and reaches up to the height of the collarbones. The important thing is to balance the spaces above and below the subject's face. The medium close-up is obtained when the subject's figure is inserted, including the upper half of the chest. In this choice it is essential to take maximum care of the position of the arms, because they become part of the composition of the frame. In the American cut, the frame drops down and reaches more or less to the knees of the subject. The American plan is mainly used in cinema. In this type of cut, the background becomes a relevant element of the frame. Two other types of cuts used in portraits are the full-length one, in which the subject is portrayed from the head to the feet, which should never be cut. In this cut, the background is important and it is necessary to make a choice, keep it in focus to have a set portrait or blur it to focus on the human figure. Finally, we have the medium field cut, which provides for the subject shot in the environment in which it is located and is called to interpret. As for the equipment and lenses to take photographic portraits, we must know that portrait photography can be done both outdoors and in a photo studio, two very different situations when it comes to light. Portrait studio photography requires equipment composed of different elements such as a background, the flash, the reflectors, the tripod, and finally the lights that can be directed or softened by diffusers such as softboxes or umbrellas. Within the studio we should necessarily increase the ISO or the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Usually a sensitivity of 400 ISO is used. Outside, natural light will be used and managed thanks to the shutter speed, aperture and sensor sensitivity. While in the studio it is the photographer who adapts the lights, outdoors it will be the photographer who will have to adapt to the light. As for the lenses most suitable for portrait photography, the most used lenses range from 50mm to 105mm. Smaller focal lengths deform the face, larger focal instead flatten it. It is good to use very bright lenses to be able to take full advantage of the depth of field and create the bokeh effect that allows you to have a clear subject's face and a blurred background, in order to bring out the portrait subject. Over the years, the photographic portrait has developed and has found numerous masters who have made this genre a real artistic form. The portrait is very important for marketing, advertising, and very often has seen the fusion of marketing and artistic expression. Among the greatest masters of the portrait we can remember Helmut Newton. Famous for his studies on the female nude and his iconic portraits, Helmut Newton, pseudonym of Helmut Neustadter, was born in Berlin on October 31, 1920. He grew up in the good bourgeoisie, and approached photography from the young age of 12. Helmut Newton's fame exploded in the late 1960s when he introduced elements closely related to sadomasochism, homosexuality and voyeurism in his portraits and fashion shots. His images end up distorting a still basically moralistic scene, but at the same time riding the revolutionary and nonconformist spirit typical of those years. The result is unprecedented success, leading him to become the most talked about and sought after photographer on the planet. Famous for his studies on the female nude and his iconic portraits, Helmut Newton died on January 23, 2004 following a car accident. Another prominent portrait photographer is Peter Lindbergh, pseudonym of Peter Bradbeck. Born in Leszno, Poland, in November 1944, he studied art in Duisburg and moved to Paris in 1978 to focus on fashion photography. His style is characterized by the choice of black and white that will accompany him throughout his career, and by a very light makeup of the subjects, almost completely absent. The people portrayed by Lindbergh are human beings, ready to tell about themselves and to undress their fears. Immortal are the portraits of celebrities who would never have been portrayed natural by anyone else, if not by him. Peter Lindbergh was a unique photographer who had a superfine technique, unattainable for many. Peter Lindbergh disappears in Paris on the 3rd of September 2019. The last portrait photographer we remember is Annie Leibovitz, who was born in Waterbury on the 2nd of October 1949, and is one of the best-known and most renowned photographers in the world currently in business. Annie Leibovitz immortalizes several celebrities, becoming one of the best-known photographers ever. Strengthened by many high-level exhibitions and various photographic books sold all over the world, his images have a strong human connotation that represents, in all respects, his vision of life and photography. John Lennon, Demi Moore, Angelina Jolie, Leonardo DiCaprio, Christo, Queen Elizabeth II, Sting, Bruce Springsteen, Meryl Streep, some of the celebrities she portrayed. Landscape is one of the most common but also the most fascinating photographic genres. To photograph a landscape, some precautions are needed. It is in fact difficult to photograph a large space without depth. A fundamental element for photographing landscapes is to carefully choose the settings of our camera. The main parameters on which you will have to act are the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO. As far as this parameter is concerned, it is always better to set it to very low values, to avoid unpleasant and useless grain effects. As for the shutter speeds to use depend on the various situations, or on the effect we want to achieve. For example, if we wanted to freeze a waterfall, the time to set must be very fast, usually around 1/1000th of a second. Conversely, if we wanted to give a movement effect, the time will be set to much slower values, even several seconds. Finally, as regards the aperture, this must be very closed, to obtain a wide depth of field. The most used are f11 and f16, to have well-defined photos in detail. Once we have identified the place to photograph, we must also choose the right moment, that is the best possible lighting to make the most of what we have in our mind. The best hours for photo wrapping are in the early morning or late afternoon, when the light is warmer and more enveloping and returns long and soft shadows that create a much more pleasant and relaxing atmosphere, with a more marked and evident sense of depth. Framing and composition are the first two fundamental steps in making landscape photography interesting. It is essential to pay close attention not only to the framing and the light but also to the composition. The composition in fact ensures that the elements taken into consideration in the photograph can coexist in a balanced way, to emphasize and enhance the overall content as much as possible. It will therefore be important to have the rule of thirds and the golden section in mind. As for the objectives, usually the most used and indicated in the landscape start from the fisheye 8 to 15 mm up to the medium telephoto around 200 mm. 24 to 70 mm or 24 to 105 mm lenses are great optics for landscape photography and are very versatile. The 16-35 mm and 17-40 mm lenses are wide-angle lenses, ideal for photographing a large portion of the landscape, and they also create a sense of visual depth due to the squashing of perspective. Finally, the 8-15 mm fisheye lens allows you to take very creative photos. However, care must be taken to obtain a pleasant and interesting final result. Finally, the accessory par excellence of the landscape photographer is the tripod. Landscape photographers often have to take long exposure shots. Even this photographic genre has had many masters who have expressed the best of landscape photography. We recall two, Ansel Adams and Franco Fontana. Ansel Adams was one of the masters of 20th century photography, one of the founding fathers of landscape photography, an innovator whose ideas and style are still current. Born in 1902 in San Francisco, he finds himself undergoing the destructive violence of nature due to the terrible earthquake that hit the city in 1906. During this event, little Ansel falls and breaks his nose, causing a slight deformity that will distinguish him throughout the life. One of the most important moments in Ansel Adams' career is in 1932 when he founded the F64 group. The name indicates the minimum aperture, a complex technique that allows you to widen the depth of field, reduce the background gradient and maximize the details of the photo. Over the years, the photographs taken by Ansel Adams became an important sponsorship to shed light on some environmental issues, mass tourism, marketing, aggressive construction. One of the reasons Ansel Adams is still studied in photography schools today is the invention of the zonal system. Born as a technique for black and white photography, today it can be used both by analog and digital photography, monochrome or not. The zonal system provides for the study of exposure to develop the whole sphere of tones that are part of a scene. The intent is to offer an image more faithful to reality and to facilitate the work of photographers when setting up the camera, especially in conditions with different light conditions. Franco Fontana is one of the most internationally famous contemporary Italian photographers. Born in Modena in 1933, he began photographing at an amateur level in 1961. From the very beginning he devoted himself to aesthetic research focused on the abstract expression of color. Franco Fontana is an eclectic photographer. His research focused above all on the use of color and geometries. The choice of subjects, whether rural, industrial or urban landscapes, is always secondary to the two protagonists of Fontana's photographs, color and geometry. Through these, the photographs of his landscapes do not just represent reality, but create an abstraction made of strong colors and clear and marked lines. In an era in which abstraction was sought almost exclusively through black and white, Fontana invented a new, elegant and unique language, immediately appreciated worldwide. This is how he recounts his predilection for color in an interview with National Geographic: "I photograph color because fortunately I see in color." The course was created by the consortium of the Eurica project funded by the Erasmus Plus program. Thanks for the attention.